In March of 1841, Solomon Northup was a man who had everything to lose. But he didn't know it yet. He was a master of the violin, a father, and a citizen of Saratoga Springs, New York. In his world, freedom wasn't a dream, it was a birthright. He walked the streets with his head high, a man of music and intellect. But history has a way of hiding predators in plain sight. It started with a chance encounter. Two men, Merrill Brown and Abram Hamilton. They were elegant, soft-spoken, and they seemed to admire Solomon's talent more than anyone he had ever met. They invited him to join their traveling circus. The pay they offered wasn't just good, it was irrational. It was more money than a musician could make in a year. Solomon felt a flicker of hesitation. Something about their smiles didn't reach their eyes. Something about the way they insisted he come with them immediately felt off. But the lure of a better life for his children was stronger than his instinct. He told no one where he was going. He wanted the gold to be a surprise for his wife. He boarded a train to Washington, D.C., the seat of American power. But as the train clicked along the tracks, Solomon noticed something. Brown and Hamilton weren't talking about the circus anymore. They were watching him, quietly, measuring him. On their final night in the capital, they sat down for a celebratory dinner. The air was thick with the smell of expensive wine and tobacco. Solomon took a sip, and in that moment, the world didn't just fade, it broke. He didn't know it yet, but Solomon Northup had just been deleted. Before we follow Solomon into the dark, I need your help. We are dedicated to uncovering the stories that were meant to stay buried. Which dark biography or story should we investigate next? Type a name or a mystery in the comments right now. We build this channel based on your curiosity. The last thing Solomon remembered was the toast. A glass of wine, a laugh from a stranger, and a sudden violent pulse in his temples. Then the world simply stopped. When his eyes finally struggled open, the elegant hotel room in Washington, D.C. was gone. The fine silk sheets had been replaced by cold, damp stone. The smell of expensive tobacco was replaced by the stench of stale sweat and rot. He tried to reach for his head, but his hands wouldn't move. A heavy, rhythmic clink echoed through the room. It was the sound of iron hitting iron. Solomon was chained to a ring in the floor. He reached for his pocket, searching for his free papers, the legal documents that proved he was a man and not property. They were gone. His money, his watch, his identity, all erased. That's when the door groaned open. A man stepped in. His name was James H. Birch. He didn't look like a circus performer. He looked like a man who owned the air Solomon was breathing. Solomon did the only thing a rational citizen would do. He spoke. He shouted, "There has been a mistake. I am a free man from New York. I have a family. Search my name." Birch didn't look surprised. He didn't look worried. He looked bored. He picked up a wooden paddle, a heavy board with holes designed to create a suction that bruised the bone without breaking the skin. Every time Solomon said the word free, the paddle fell. Every time he mentioned New York, the whip followed. This was the true psychological birth of the nightmare. Birch wasn't just hurting his body, he was rewriting his soul. "You are a runaway from Georgia," Birch whispered between the strikes. "Your name is Platt. If you ever say the name Solomon again, you won't live to see the sun." In that basement, just blocks away from the President of the United States, Solomon Northup realized the terrifying truth. He hadn't just been kidnapped. He had been uninstalled from the world. To everyone who loved him, he was now a ghost. To the men in that room, he was simply stock. James Birch didn't keep his merchandise in Washington for long. Exposure was a risk. Under the cover of a moonless night, Solomon and a group of others were marched through the streets like shadows. They reached the Potomac River, where a brig named the Orleans waited. As Solomon stepped onto that deck, he felt the wood groan beneath his feet. It was the sound of a door closing on his life. The ship pulled away from the dock, and for the first time, Solomon looked at the disappearing shoreline of the North. Imagine the psychological weight of that moment. He knew the geography. He knew that every mile the ship traveled south, his free papers became more of a fantasy, and his chains became more of a reality. He was moving from a world of laws to a world of ownership. Below deck, the air was a thick, poisonous soup of salt, sweat, and despair. It was here that Solomon met the first witnesses to his nightmare, most notably a woman named Eliza. Eliza is the psychological mirror of Solomon's own fear. She was poised, educated, and had lived a life of relative luxury as the mistress of a wealthy man who had promised her freedom. But when he died, the promise died with him. She was sold alongside her two children, Randall and Emily. Throughout the voyage, Solomon watched as Eliza was systematically broken, not by the whip, but by the anticipation. The sailors would mock her, telling her that as soon as they reached New Orleans, her children would be sold separate. The horror wasn't just the chains, it was the sound of a mother trying to memorize her children's faces before they were deleted from her life forever. But Solomon was not a man who surrendered. In the dark of the hold, he began to whisper. He found a man named Arthur, another free man who had been snatched from the streets of Norfolk. Together, they plotted a mutiny. They had a plan. They would wait for the night watch, steal a key, and take the ship. Solomon was a strategist. He was ready to kill to reclaim his name. But the universe had another horror in store. Smallpox broke out. The speckled monster turned the ship into a floating morgue. The mutiny died before it began. Solomon watched as the sick were treated like spoiled cargo, sometimes thrown overboard while the heart was still beating. Arthur, his only ally, was one of the first to go. When the Orleans finally docked in New Orleans, Solomon didn't see a city of lights. He saw the slave pen of Theophilus Freeman. He was led onto a yard covered in white sand, told to stand straight, and forced to play his violin while Freeman's clients inspected his teeth and his muscles like he was a farm animal. The violin, the instrument that once brought him prestige in New York, was now the soundtrack to his own auction. He was no longer a man, he was lot number 33, and the man stepping forward to buy him was about to change his life in a way Solomon never expected. The man who bought lot 33 was named William Ford. He was a Baptist preacher, a man of soft words and high morals. In his memoirs, Solomon wrote something that feels like a cold shiver. There never was a more kind, noble, candid, Christian man than William Ford. This is the peak of the psychological horror. Ford didn't beat Solomon. He didn't scream. He gave Solomon a place to sleep and recognized his immense intelligence. When Solomon used his engineering skills to build a giant lumber raft that saved Ford thousands of dollars in transport costs, Ford gave him a violin. But here is the trap. Ford's kindness was a cage made of silk. He saw Solomon's genius, he heard Solomon's music, and he still considered him a piece of livestock. He was a good master, but a master nonetheless. He held Solomon's soul in his hand and refused to open his fingers. The illusion of safety shattered when Ford fell into financial ruin. In the world of the Bayou, when a good man goes broke, his property pays the price. To satisfy a debt, Ford was forced to sell a portion of Solomon's life to a man named John M. Tibeats. If Ford was the silk cage, Tibeats was the jagged wire. He was a small, bitter man, a carpenter who realized almost immediately that Solomon, his slave, was a better craftsman than he would ever be. This sparked a deep, murderous jealousy. One afternoon, over a dispute about the size of some nails, Tibeats snapped. He came at Solomon with a whip. But Solomon, fueled by 12 years of suppressed New York pride, did the unthinkable. He fought back. He took the whip from Tibeats and beat the master until he fled into the woods. Solomon stood alone on the plantation, the adrenaline fading into a cold, paralyzing realization. In Louisiana, a slave who strikes a master is a dead man. Tibeats returned hours later with 2 men and a rope. They didn't give him a trial. They didn't ask for his story. They tied his hands behind his back and threw the rope over a high branch of a peach tree. They pulled until Solomon was suspended in the air. For an entire day, Solomon Northup hung in the burning sun. He watched the other slaves work in the fields nearby. They looked at him, their eyes filled with tears, but they didn't move. They couldn't. To help him was to join him. He stood on his tiptoes until his calves turned to fire, then to ice, then to nothing. He wasn't saved by a hero. He was saved by a mortgage. William Ford still owned a legal interest in Solomon, and the plantation overseer eventually cut him down because Tibeats didn't have the right to destroy the collateral. Gasping for air on the dirt, Solomon realized that his life didn't belong to God, and it didn't belong to him. It belonged to a bank. And that bank was about to transfer him to the final circle of hell, the great pine woods, and a man named Edwin Epps. Edwin Epps was a man who believed he was a king, simply because there was no one in the Bayou Boeuf to tell him he was a monster. He didn't buy Solomon to build houses or navigate rafts. He bought Solomon to be a machine. Epps was a breaker. He was an alcoholic whose moods were dictated by the bottle. On the Epps plantation, the day didn't begin with the sun. It began with the sound of the lash. Epps had a twisted, psychological ritual. When he was drunk, he would wake the slaves in the middle of the night and force them to dance. He would stagger through the room with a whip, lashing anyone who slowed down from exhaustion. To Epps, his slaves weren't just workers. They were toys for his boredom and targets for his rage. But there was one person who suffered more than all the rest combined. Her name was Patsy. Patsy was what they called the Queen of the Fields. She was a phenomenon. While the strongest men struggled to pick 200 pounds of cotton a day, Patsy could pick 500. She was fast, she was tireless, and she was brilliant. But in the world of Edwin Epps, brilliance was a curse. Epps was obsessed with her. It was a dark, possessive lust that he called love, but it manifested as pure violence. He raped her repeatedly, driven by a desire to own her soul as much as her body. And then there was Mary Epps, the master's wife. If Edwin was the fire, Mary was the ice. She was consumed by a cold, sharp jealousy. She knew what her husband was doing to Patsy, and she punished the girl for it. Solomon describes Mary Epps sitting on the porch, throwing heavy crystal decanters at Patsy's face as she walked by, hoping to mar the beauty that her husband couldn't stop looking at. The psychological horror reached its peak on a day that started over a simple bar of soap. Patsy had gone to a neighboring plantation to borrow a piece of soap to wash herself. She wanted to feel clean in a place that felt filthy. When she returned, Epps was waiting in a drunken fury. He accused her of going to see another man. He had her tied to 4 stakes driven into the earth, stripping her naked in front of everyone. Epps was too drunk to aim the whip himself, so he handed it to Solomon. Imagine the absolute psychological destruction of that moment. Solomon, a man of dignity and music, was forced to flay the skin off the only friend he had in the bayou. Epps stood over them, screaming, "Strike her, or I'll strike you." Solomon whipped her until he couldn't see through his own tears. When he finally threw the whip down and refused to continue, Epps took it and finished the job with a savage delight. Patsy didn't die that day, but the queen was gone. She became a walking ghost, her spirit finally deleted by the sheer weight of the cruelty. Solomon realized then that under Epps, time didn't move forward. It just circled. He had been a slave for 10 years. His children were now adults he didn't recognize. His wife was likely a widow in her own mind. He was in a hole so deep the light of the north couldn't reach him. But in the 11th year, a stranger arrived, a man who didn't belong in the bayou, a man who still believed in the words that Solomon had been beaten for saying. In 1852, a man named Samuel Bass arrived at the Epps plantation to help build a new house. Bass was a carpenter from Canada, and in the suffocating heat of the bayou, he was a breath of icy northern air. He was loud, opinionated, and he didn't care who he offended. Solomon sat nearby, working in silence, as he heard Bass say something that no one in Louisiana dared to whisper. In the eyes of God, there is no difference between a white man and a black man. For the first time in 12 years, Solomon saw a crack in the wall. He took the ultimate gamble. He approached Bass in secret. He told him his real name. He told him about the violin in Saratoga Springs and the family that didn't know if he was alive or buried in a swamp. Bass risked his life. If Epps had found out, both men would have been hanging from the peach trees before sunset. But Bass wrote the letters. He sent them to the north, directed to the people Solomon hoped hadn't forgotten him. In New York, the letters landed like a bomb. Henry B. Northup, the son of the man who had once owned Solomon's father, took the evidence to the governor. They invoked the 1840 New York Liberty Act, a law specifically designed to protect kidnapped citizens. On January 4, 1853, a carriage pulled up to the Epps plantation. A sheriff stepped out, followed by a man from Solomon's past. Epps was a cornered animal. He screamed, he cursed, he demanded his property stay. But the papers were back. The deletion was being reversed. Solomon walked to the carriage. He didn't look back at Epps. He didn't even look back at the fields. He only looked at the road heading north. The homecoming was not a fairy tale. When Solomon walked into his house in New York, his children didn't recognize him. His wife Anne looked at him as if he were a resurrected spirit. He had missed the weddings, the births, the decade where a man becomes an elder. He sought justice. He sued James Birch, the man who first beat him in the D.C. cellar. But the psychological horror of the era had one final blow. Because of the laws of the time, a black man was forbidden from testifying against a white man in a court of law. Birch walked free. The men who deleted Solomon Northup were never punished by the world of men. Solomon wrote his book, 12 Years a Slave. He became a voice for the voiceless, a hero of the abolitionist movement. But the trauma of the Bayou never truly left him. In 1857, the story takes its final, darkest turn. Solomon went to Canada for a speaking tour, and then he vanished. No death certificate was ever filed. No grave has ever been found. Some believe he was kidnapped a second time. Others believe he went into hiding to help the Underground Railroad, choosing to live as a shadow so others could live in the light. Solomon Northup was a man whom history tried to erase twice. The first time, he fought his way back. The second time, he chose the silence. He remains the ultimate reminder that freedom is a fragile thing, and a name is the only thing we truly own. Solomon's story survived because he refused to let his mind be chained. If this journey through the dark archives moved you, hit the like button and subscribe. And tell me in the comments, do you think Solomon was taken again, or did he choose to disappear? See you in the next Shadow of History.